So, welcome everybody. Thank you for the introduction, Claire. It's truly a pleasure and really a PhD student's dream to be able to speak to a group of people, a group of like-minded individuals in the group room that not only focus on research, but also practice and policy. I wanted to begin by first acknowledging my position in my research. This is important in all different types of research, but particularly when it comes to qualitative research, which I'm going to mainly be speaking about today. What I am is a health promotion researcher, and I'm an educator at the university level, and I hold the worldview that is integral to engage partners throughout the research process, specifically as it relates to children and youth. What I'm not is a teacher or a facilitator within the elementary, middle, or high school level. However, I am a self-defined professional student. I think I've done about 22 years of school in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and Mi'kma'ki. So I want to take that and I want to share that because the subjectivity and biases I bring into this work is seen as a strength, not a limitation. And I want you to think about your own subjectivity that you bring into your work when working with youth, working at different levels, and how that actually can help be a strength in analyzing and interpreting work. So with that, I would also like to, on the front end, sincerely thank the students, the youth engagement coordinators, the staff at UpLift, and our partners for the work that I'm going to be presenting today. I am going to be presenting my research, but it is really framed in a wider project that we're working on at UpLift, which is essentially to develop a roadmap for student engagement and health promotion in schools. So I will be speaking about the research, but there's a lot of practice elements that have also been put into this work that is over the past 5 to 6 years, even more to 10 since Sarah's vision of UpLift began. So let's first get ourselves grounded in research when it comes to student engagement in HPS. This has really been something that we began to talk about over the past two decades, and it is recognized provincially, nationally, and internationally that student engagement is a core component of health promoting schools. And this specifically aligns with the United Nations Conventions on the Right of the Child, which was ratified in 1989, which essentially promotes that children and youth need to be listened to, they need to be heard, and they need to be actively engaged in decisions affecting their lives. So what does student engagement mean? What does youth engagement mean? This term is thrown around a lot and there really isn't any specific definition. So the one that I landed on that I really like is this one from Rifkin et al. That is quite old, from 1988. They use the term participation. And it's idea that meaningful participation must be active. It can't just be informing students about health information. Participation must involve choice. Students need to have choice in the matter of what they would like to be involved in. And participation must be potentially effective. So if we don't actually take an idea and actualize it, it can be somewhat meaningless rather than meaningful. But when we take these ideas of youth engagement and student engagement and we think, okay, there's tons of work when it comes to this in the literature and practice, but can we easily transition and transfer this to health promoting schools? Or is there some nuances about HPS, about child and health learning that we need to say, okay, how do we do this effectively to enhance student learning and essentially enhance this model that we're focusing on? So that is a little bit of how my research comes into play. So what we do know about student engagement in health promoting schools is that we do know that there's very positive outcomes of this. And this is a systematic review of 26 studies that is on the slide today. So we do know that students have improved knowledge, competence, motivation, and commitment to health and well-being. We do know that adults form greater relationships with youth and can understand young people better when they're engaged. And we know at the system level, at the school level, that schools become more responsive to students' needs, policies, and programs. And Stephanie is going to talk about how we know at UpLift that we've gained these positive outcomes in students and youth. But one thing that we don't know is essentially, how do we get here? What is the road to success? What are those process factors that need to be put in place to have meaningful student engagement? We talk a lot about evidence-informed, evidence-based outcomes, but to get there, we really need those evidence-based strategies. And when we talk about implementation science, that's exactly what we mean. So, this question about what the process factors for youth engagement are is not just at the local level at UpLift that we've been trying to think about. This is also at the global level that we've been dealing with this issue, trying to figure out okay, in what way do we need to put these factors in place? What are these essential conditions, as Kate was speaking about? So, my research took a two-pronged approach. We looked at the what is happening globally in the evidence and also what is happening locally through the UpLift Partnership. So, I'm very briefly going to go through my methods, and if anybody wants to speak to me about them afterwards, I'm happy to do so. But because, again, we only have so much time, I'm going to have just 2 or 3 slides on them. So, for the global focus, we conducted a scoping review, which is essentially a way to map and characterize a big chunk of the literature into one piece of work. And this is a barcode to our preprint if anybody wants to look at, because with a lot of research, it takes about a year to get this work published. And to show the rigor of this, I just want to put this slide up, that this was over 2,500 sources that we screened through to get to 50 sources that focused on this work to understand what is happening in the world and how can we understand the process of student engagement in HPS. Now, when it comes locally, we really wanted to help to contextualize this work. What is the magic that's happening at UpLift, and how can we understand what the factors are that are being put in place? So to do so, as a researcher, I gained the perspectives and worked with the youth engagement coordinators and different students from across from across the province to understand what works for them and what isn't working for them. And we wanted to do this in a way that we wanted to practice essentially what we preached. If we are studying student engagement, I also wanted to make sure that I meaningfully engage youth engagement coordinators and students within the research process. So we used a participatory co-design approach to gain their perspective, but also to analyze and interpret that work with them. And this is briefly just a graphic facilitation from one of the co-design workshops with students, in which we use art-based approaches. We use participatory mapping to be able to understand what they really liked about this process when they were involved in these student action grants. So I'm going to take you on a little bit of a journey throughout this roadmap that I'm speaking about. And I did a little Google search from the UpLift Core site to here. It was going to take me an hour to speak about this whole thing. But I really don't have that much time. I probably have about 15 minutes left. So I'm going to focus on the components of this roadmap that my research really informed. And the idea of this roadmap is that it would be essentially a guide to adults or students entering into student engagement in HPS, and maybe a few principles they want to bring along the way to make sure that they're able to do this effectively and get to those positive outcomes. So in its current form, and this is very much still a draft, we have outlined 10 different phases to this roadmap. And the ones that have the little yellow dots are what I'm going to speak about today, and the findings that came from the YEC co-design, the student co-design, as well as the scoping review. And again, this is very contextualized to Nova Scotia, and we are working towards building and expanding this to how can this be transferable to other jurisdictions. So what you can first see is a lot of what I'm going to be speaking about is what we call, here, let me use my little thing here, is the pre-work. So at the beginning here, even before you kind of get into the stages of those projects, what needs to be done, what needs to be put in place within a school before actually implementing that project with students. The first one we called self-reflection. And to me, this is one of the most important concepts to consider about this approach. It's essentially the idea that it's more important to understand how you are going to engage students than what the steps actually are. And this came from a term that one of the YECs used called a way of being. What I just proposed at the start of my project when I was speaking about my positionality, this is essentially the idea of what position do the YECs or other adults in these roles come with? What are their beliefs? What are their values when you're relating it to student engagement? You need to have this idea that youth voice is important and it needs to be amplified. So idea of self-reflecting on that and also understanding what I need to learn. What are the competencies I need to be able to develop prior to going into this work? And when I was listening to Kate's presentation, I felt like this specifically aligned with the idea of demonstrating leadership. You need to be able to reflect on what you need to bring to the project prior to engaging students. The second one I'm going to speak about is titled Investigating the School Environment. And this is the idea of not only understanding the positionality of yourself in this role, but what is the position of the school that you're walking into. So you need to understand what is happening at the school. What are the school ethos? What is the culture, the history, the resources that are happening right now? And the YECs describe this very much as the idea of understanding where that container of possibility is. Excuse me, I might actually need that water. I think it's just dry up here. Um, it's not just you. And this was the idea of knowing when to push the boundaries or maybe where you need to pause where those obstacles are at. And this is essentially a very important thing to understand as we say that each school is very unique to their own. So where can we go with a school and where are the limitations potentially at? The third one I want to bring up is building a foundation for partnerships. And we talk about partnerships all the time. It's a complex, but one of the most important parts of our work. Our work is relational. We speak about it constantly. And I wanted to bring up the idea not only of those partnerships with teachers and administrators, but those partnerships with students that needs to happen even prior to developing an inclusive and productive team. And the idea here was really interesting because what came from students and from YCs was not just that it was about, those good relationships that you're having, that you're connecting with the student, but it was about the reliability of of adult coming in and working on their projects with them. And this was extremely interesting because we have been working to sustain these YECs throughout this 4-year initiative. And they spoke about the idea that, of course, there has been staff turnover again and again when it comes to HPS. It is it has been hard to sell to the schools about the impact of this work. But the idea from students and also from the YECs were saying that when we come in again and again and they see that we're coming in there, that we're going to finish this project from start to finish, that is where they begin to build that trusting relationship. And students want that accountability. They want to know the schedule when the YEC is coming in. And this is an extremely important component of the reliability of this work. Now, let's take a pause because that to me is seen as all the pre-work. We haven't even gotten into implementing or developing the project. The next three components that I'm going to speak about are really when we're beginning to build that team with students and engaging them in the most meaningful way that we can. Fostering a productive and inclusive team. This specific component came out very much from the students that I spoke with, in which they needed to have this team that, of course, was inclusive, but also was productive. And they identified some of these things that we kind of take for granted when it comes to energizers, facilitators, teamwork exercises that are absolutely essential to start a team prior to going into that ideation phase, prior to going into that visioning, and to that brainstorm. And I just want to take a moment to read this quote from a student. I know there's many quotes across these boards, but the student ones are the most important, I believe. She did a lot of team building exercises too, which really helped us because to make an inclusive space, you really have to be inclusive with each other. And that was one thing that we really needed, help with a team kind of learning tool. And the students spoke a lot about how these adults in these roles help them to understand how to bring in and understand different people's perspectives and how that can be a magical thing when you're developing and compromising on work. That we are able to understand different perspectives, how they can all be seen within a project, and how we can compromise and collate this work. Exploring well-being. To me, this component specifically pinpoints when I speak about, okay, what is the difference in student engagement in general, and what is the difference of student engagement in the HPS context? The idea with exploring well-being is that young people are frequently treated as recipients of knowledge. We as adults often will tell them what is healthy and what is not. But in a health room in schools model, we want to take that away and give them the space, both physically and socially, to be able to explore what health and well-being means to them. And most of the time, they can come up with the most amazing ideas that we would never think about. And this is the idea that health means so much to so many different people that we can never define it and then share it. We need to go away from that traditional meaning of health education and explore well-being in this more holistic environment. This exploring well-being component also focuses on the idea that one of my committee members said as creating mini health promoters, essentially. So this is the idea that we are trying to connect them with the greater social and physical environment, just how we've learned later in life, and being able to integrate that into their learning and their competencies. And a student said this really well, that we need to understand kind of that needs versus want idea. We need to understand what we as maybe an individual wants versus what the school needs or what a more vulnerable population needs. And that is how they entered into the idea of what they may want their project or initiative to be. And last, but probably the most important, is action-oriented learning. We all know that this is the best approach to do hands-on and being able to do something, you're able to learn a bit more. And this is one specifically that came from the students through and through, is that if they do not have an idea come to action, they feel like that engagement piece is missing. And this is why that student action grant was so important, because they are able to actually have a tangible way of seeing how their idea came to operation. And I'll end by reading this one student's quote. It's one thing to just like philosophize something, this could be better, but it's another thing to actually have concrete ideas about what to do to fix it. And that was very valuable, especially as a young adult, just like the sort of practicing those skills of like, okay, what we can actually do to fix this. So coming back to this roadmap, and I only touched on 6 of the 10 here, I'll leave it to Stephanie to speak about the evaluation portion. The idea here is just to understand a little bit more how we get from all of this into effective student engagement. If we don't understand the steps or the stages to get there, then we're left up to this idea of, okay, maybe that will work. If we throw something at it, maybe it will work. But just understanding a little bit more about those guidelines and the guidance, we can help to expand this work and make it more effective, more longer term. And I want to end with this quote from a researcher that I've followed since kind of getting into this field, who does this work in Europe, in Denmark. And it's the idea that participation could be viewed as both a means and an end of health promoting intervention. It's the idea that participation is the end, it's the beginning, and it's everything in between. And that's specifically what we try to do with our work. Participation is the absolute core of health promoting schools. And I think I might have ended a few minutes early. So that is my information. If you want to get in touch, that QR code also goes to a bunch of different blogs that I've written about health promoting schools and student engagement.
Thank you very much, Julia.